Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Solana, and we're going to be looking at its Bitcoin valuation. We're also going to be making comparisons to the ETH Bitcoin valuation. Now, you may say, well, didn't we just do that in the last video? We did, but we sort of focused more on the quantitative side. And we're going to look at the quantitative side a little bit in this video, but I would actually prefer to focus more on the emotional side and what causes people to ignore certain views at certain points and then only choose to listen to them at other points, and how that can really lead to major swings in emotion that can be used, and people will get mad at me even though my views ultimately never actually changed, right? So um it would be prudent to remember that, as always, altcoins tend to be oscillators at best against Bitcoin, right? And so I've talked a lot about how what I think is happening with Sol Bitcoin is that it's following ETH Bitcoin. Now, a lot of people are confused by that because they're like, well, Solana has outperformed Ethereum a lot over the last couple of years. And so how can you say they're the same? Well, I'm not saying they're the same in time. I'm saying that Solana could be either here or here, and this leg will likely eventually happen. Now, the question is, does Sol Bitcoin get this rally in the meantime, or has that already happened? That's what I'm not sure of, right? I'm just trying to be honest. That's what I'm not sure of. Now, what happened with ETH Bitcoin is I said here that it was in a distribution phase and that it would likely go down to about 0.03. And it looks like it actually went lower than that, right? It's now at 0.027. Now, when I made that video back then saying that ETH Bitcoin would collapse, a lot of people didn't want to listen to it. But they sure as hell were ready to listen to it at 0.049, right? They were willing to listen there, but they were not willing to listen up here. And so what ended up happening is that a lot of people did not like me for saying it was in a distribution phase right here. They then thought I was right down here. So they sold. They sold back to Bitcoin. And then ETH Bitcoin rallied up to another macro lower high, right? That's what ultimately happened. Now, this part of the market was very difficult for me, right? I like to stick to the sort of the quantitative side. I really do just want to help people preserve the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio. But this period was a really difficult time because while the valuation was still at the valuation it was at, more or less, when I warned people that it was in a distribution phase. But the problem that I didn't really anticipate was that a lot of the people didn't listen to me here. They only listened to me down here. And so then what ended up happening was ETH Bitcoin got this bounce back up, and it stayed up there for months before coming back down, right? If you look at the time between when ETH Bitcoin made this low in June of 2022 to when it finally broke that low, that was a year and a half later, right? That was a year and a half later. So if Sol Bitcoin does something similar to that, there's always a chance, right, that it bounces back up at some point and then slowly bleeds out later on in 2025 and into 2026. And that's something that it's hard if you're making videos on this stuff, because my opinion, as you guys know, doesn't often change, right? Like if I think an alt is in a distribution phase, I will say it whether it's here, 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 or here. Where I find difficulty is that a lot of people are not willing to listen up here. They're only willing to listen when it drops. And so then a majority of people end up finally making the trade at a low rather than listening to me at the high. And so then what happens is they panic sell. Then the market rips them a new one as it goes back up. And who do they take it out on? yours truly, right? They take it out on me because they're like, well, you said it was in a distribution phase. Now, with ETH Bitcoin, it was never not in a distribution phase, right? It was never not in one. This was an entire distribution phase. Even the merge rally was still a distribution phase. But the problem is that this took a long time. I mean, the rally from the low to the high took several months, and then it took several months up here before it ultimately bled back down. Now, anyone who sold ETH for Bitcoin right there, which is when I did, back at around 0.075, now that it's at 0.027, it doesn't really matter that it came down and then bounced back up and then ultimately bled out, right? I mean, today, it's so much lower. It's at 0.027. It doesn't matter, right? It just simply doesn't matter. But during this time, the emotions were extremely high, right? During the crash and then the subsequent rally, okay? Now, back then, ETH Bitcoin spent about a month at those lows, right? It was about a month. And this is where it gets tricky for Sol Bitcoin, because there's two ways you could look at this. And I truly am making this video trying to help people out. I'm not coming at it from like a perspective of not trying to do that. I'm trying to just help people see the market the way I saw ETH Bitcoin and how emotions took over and how it was very difficult for people to navigate that. And hopefully some people can learn lessons. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, you shouldn't compare Solana to Ethereum. Look, guys, and I'm actually seeing the same type of arguments, like, well, you're not taking into case the fundamentals and all this other stuff. But they said the same thing about ETH, right? They said, I'm not taking into account the fundamentals, I'm not taking into account the proof of stake aspect, it being deflationary. There is all that stuff sort of thrown at me. And I it was hard because ultimately I was pretty certain that ETH Bitcoin would eventually bleed, but no one listened up here. Everyone wanted to listen down here. And then I was the person they got mad up here. So when you look at Sol Bitcoin, what is essentially going on? Well, for the last 6 to 7 months, I've been pretty clear that I thought Solana was in a distribution phase on its Bitcoin pair, right? And I put out 3 to 4 videos last year saying that this was a distribution phase. Now, a lot of people didn't like that, and they didn't listen to it. And that was back when Sol Bitcoin was, at around 25,000, 26,000 sats. No one wanted to listen. Now that it's dropping, all of a sudden, people are more willing to listen, And it can be difficult because then, like, my opinion of it never actually changed, right? Like, just like with ETH Bitcoin, I thought this was a distribution phase. I thought it was in a distribution phase down here. I thought it was in a distribution phase right there and right there, right? And here and here. It never actually changed, but the emotions were all over the place. So with Solana, I wonder, right? I wonder if the same thing's going to happen where no one wants to listen to the distribution phase idea when it's up here. They're only willing to listen to it when it comes down here. But by that point, they end up being the people that then create that bottom that then there's a bounce from at some point, maybe in a few weeks, And again, I don't know exactly how low Sol Bitcoin's going to go. I know that when ETH Bitcoin put in this low right here, right? I know when that happened, it took, how many weeks did it take, right? So when the candles turned red and basically only red, how long did it take? You can see that there were basically 5 red candles. I mean, this is 4 weeks because there, the distance from here to here is 4 weeks, but it was 5 red candles. And then it was the 6th candle that actually formed that local bottom. So for Sol Bitcoin, you could argue that it was sort of going into that right here. And then it sort of deviated as there was the meme coin launch by the president of the United States. Kind of a weird sentence to say. And now we're sort of 3, 4, 5. We're currently in the 5th week right now, right? So we're currently in the 5th week, which arguably is that week, right? It's that week right there. Now, during that time, Bitcoin USD, what was it doing, right? It was dropping. And ultimately speaking, Bitcoin wasn't really doing that well while ETH Bitcoin was going down. And then when Bitcoin bottomed out for a while, right, when it basically just kind of bottomed out for a while, then ETH Bitcoin got a massive rally. ETH USD didn't really go anywhere close to its prior high, but because Bitcoin wasn't really moving and ETH was rallying into the merge, it allowed for, for ETH Bitcoin to go back up, even though it was a temporary move. And then ultimately ETH Bitcoin rally, or it faded back to the downside as Bitcoin, went lower again and then eventually went into another rally, right? So for me, when I sort of think about what's a lesson that I learned and dealing with the whole ETH Bitcoin stuff, and I've been telling myself, like, don't even get involved with the whole Sol Bitcoin stuff because it's just going to be a carbon copy of my experience with ETH Bitcoin, right? People are not going to listen at the highs. They're going to panic sell the lows. They're going to blame me on a rally to a lower high, and then they're going to FOMO back in at a lower high, and then they're going to then watch it bleed back down again. So there's two ways to look at this, right? There's two ways, and please understand, I'm truly just trying to help. I'm not trying to dunk. I'm not trying to convince you to panic sell your Solana. There likely will be lower high rallies in the future, even if my view is ultimately correct. Now, here's where I'm not 100% sure what the most likely outcome is. For ETH Bitcoin, right? For ETH Bitcoin, it got this rally right here, right? So if you take the move to the high to the low, right, it had a rally back up to the 786 with a wick above the 786. You see that? You see how it had that rally back above the 786, and the rallies that came before it were not above the 786. Well, I guess they didn't have this low, but when you take it up from that low, these other rallies were not nearly as high. You see that? So it's notable that that rally basically almost took ETH Bitcoin to a new cycle high, but not quite. In fact, the rally was about 3% lower than the actual high. So what I thought was going to happen with Solana, and I was pretty clear about this, I said it would likely do the same thing that ETH Bitcoin did. It would break down and then get a rally into a macro lower high. Now, when you take that low, right, right there, you can see that it rallied up to around the 786. It was higher than these other rallies, but it went to around the 786. Now, as measured from the prior high, Sol Bitcoin was about 9% below, right? About 9% below the prior high. So then I'm trying to figure out, right? If the rally that ETH Bitcoin had, right? If this rally that ETH Bitcoin had back up to the highs, has that already happened? Or is it behind us, And I don't know the answer to that question, right? I don't. It's a little different because when ETH Bitcoin broke down, it just went, by the time it went back up, right, that was the top, the secondary, the macro lower high. And then from that point, it was just basically down only with occasional lower high rallies. With Sol Bitcoin, you could argue that it already had that rally, right? Because it came down here and then got that rally back up. But the thing that, I'm not 100% sure about is if you look at ETH Bitcoin and you say, take this whole structure that we've looked at, and the reason we've done this is because ETH Bitcoin basically dropped 89% and Sol Bitcoin dropped 89%, right, from that high. You see that? They were both 89% drops. And then they both rallied several 100%. Now, what's interesting, though, is if you take a fib retracement for Sol Bitcoin here, one of the things you'll notice is that it's currently at the 236, the 0.236 fib retracement, right? So that's where it currently is right now, at the 0.236. The 0.236 corresponds to around 14 to 15,000 sats. And you can see right now that Solana Bitcoin is right around 15 to 16,000 sats. So that's where it is right now. So then I was curious, well, where is ETH Bitcoin, right? Where did ETH Bitcoin get that bounce? And if you actually take a fib retracement on it, you'll see that it actually did get a bounce. That bounce was at the 0.236. That was at that level. So what I think is happening is it's sort of a combination of what happened already and ultimately what happened with ETH Bitcoin. That's a little confusing the way I said it, but what I mean is that you could argue that the launch of a meme coin on Solana by the president allowed it to get that rally, when maybe if that hadn't happened, and again, this is sort of like playing to the narrative, which I don't really like, but maybe had that not happened, it would have just gone straight down here already, and then that rally would have occurred. But it already happened, and so now I'm like, well, if you do get a rally off this level, which you very well could, right? Especially if there are people that are panic selling after all this time. But what I would say is that if Sol Bitcoin holds at this level for a few weeks and it starts to go back up, it might be very common for people to think that it's going to do exactly what ETH Bitcoin did and just go back up, to that same level, right? That it was at, right? I mean, with ETH Bitcoin, it basically rallied back up to the 0.5. But note that the rally from the low was to the 0.5, right? So 0.5 and 0.5, whereas Sol Bitcoin actually rallied to the 618. You see? So there could be an example here where it might go back up, but it could very well top out well below the 618. I would not expect it to take out that high. And I'm confused whether this rally that people might be expecting from this low, has that already happened with that rally? Because that's what I would have expected it to look like, and this is what we called for, right? We called for a breakdown in Q4, a rally in Q1 of 2025, and then sort of a slow bleed. And so it's difficult now because now I have all these people that ignored me back when it was at 25,000 sats, when I told people it was in a distribution phase. Now, I was reading the comments in the last video. Now, people are panic selling, right? They're panicking. And I'm like, guys, we talked about this in the last video, right? Like, why do people always make rash decisions when the market is not going in their favor? But when I'm trying to present an argument, when the market is relatively well behaved, a lot of people don't care about it. They only care to listen during capitulations. And that's the frustrating thing, right? It's really frustrating because you guys know, like, I'm actually really stubborn when it comes to the markets. Like, if I have an opinion about something, I will just say it over and over and over again until it either happens or I eventually give up on it. Take Ethereum going home, for example, on its USD pair. I mean, I've been calling for that forever and it hasn't happened. Like, I'm very stubborn and I'm not going to just change my opinion because I think that it might get a counter trend rally for a few weeks that people then might dunk on me for, So what I'm trying to say is that by the end of 2026, I think Sol Bitcoin will probably be somewhere over here, is my guess. Kind of like ETH Bitcoin, right? Is now all the way down here. But from that level, it took a long time to get there, right? It took a very long time to get there. This was a bounce for ETH Bitcoin that a lot of people were not anticipating. For me, it never really bothered me because I made the trade up here. A lot of people didn't make the trade until down here. And then they felt like they made a bad trade for a long time. They ended up panic buying back at the tops. And then they eventually capitulated. And then it was sort of the slow bleed back down. So I just want people to be aware of that. I can have an opinion about a market. I'm not going to change my opinion just because I believe there might be a counter trend rally. I know that my experience with ETH Bitcoin was trying to plead with people up here that it was in a distribution phase, not people not listening, watching it come down here, and I continued to say it was in a distribution phase. It came back up, people got mad, and then it slowly bled. Right? That's what happened. And this period up here was very difficult for me, because basically I used to be very bullish on ETH Bitcoin in 2019. The very first video on my channel is actually right here where I said that ETH Bitcoin was very bullish. And what ended up happening was I made a lot of friends in the Ethereum community, and it was all fun for a while. But then when I pivoted my view on ETH Bitcoin, a lot of those people then didn't like me anymore because they're like, well, you turned your back on Ethereum. Right now you're just talking about Bitcoin dominance and you're just a Bitcoin maxi, and then they made a lot of videos about me and said all sorts of things. But, it was all my view, which is coming from the chart of what I thought was going to happen. What I didn't anticipate back then was I just thought it was in this distribution phase and that it would go back down. And the market completely ripped my face off with this rally, right? And it was a really hard time. Not because I was really out on my trade. I mean, it never truly went that much higher than where I sold it at. Because I made the conversion right there. So it only ever briefly wicked above where I made the conversions at. But it was still difficult because I was dealing with the people that converted it down here. So with Solana, what I would say is this. With the Sol Bitcoin pair, it's down a lot in a really short period of time, right? It is. It's down a lot in a really short period of time. If you look at the fib retracement on this chart, you can see that it's basically at the 0.236, which is where ETH Bitcoin ultimately bounced, right? We know that, or I need to take it from way back over here, right? We know that's ultimately where it bounced from, but it was a lower high. So what I think is the most likely outcome for Sol is that there will likely be counter trend rallies to macro lower highs, right? That is the most likely outcome. There were a ton of them for Ethereum, right? A lot. I mean, there was this one and then this one. And it was like every step of the way, there was like a counter trend rally that people were like, oh, you were wrong. It's hard to convince people at highs. It's easier to convince them at capitulation lows. And then they get mad when it bounces back up, right? To just the same level that it was at when you were calling for the distribution phase in the first place. So please be aware that this is going on. I wish this was a lot clearer in terms of the comparison, because with ETH Bitcoin, the breakdown occurred and then the next rally was to the lower high. And for Sol, I don't know if that rally is behind us or not, because you can see it already broke down and had this rally to a lower high. Structurally, this rally already happened for Sol Bitcoin, right? It already happened when you look at sort of the breakdown of the higher low structure. Like that already happened. But from this tool, right, from the fib retracement tool, if you just want to get technical with ETH Bitcoin, you can see that it actually bottomed there at the 0.236, got a rally back up, and then ultimately faded, and now it's well below the 0.236, right? Now it's so far below it, no one even cares anymore. Hell, at this point, even if ETH Bitcoin doubled from the low of 0.023, it still wouldn't be at where it was at this capitulation wick, right? It still wouldn't even be at that level, which is crazy to think about, right? It's crazy to think about. So what I would say with Sol Bitcoin is this, right? So that I can be clear about what I'm thinking. What I would say is this, is if Sol Bitcoin can hold the 0.236 through March, right? If it can hold it for an entire month, like ETH Bitcoin did, right? And again, it wasn't just a single week, it was a month. I mean, you basically had it just hanging out at the lows from June until about mid-July. So, if you're curious how to navigate this, if Sol Bitcoin hangs above the 0.236 fib retracement level from, let's say, now until early April, then it would start to favor, right? It would start to favor a counter trend rally back to a lower high. Now, that lower high could be the 382 at 20,000 sats. It could be the 0.5 at 25,000 sats, right? It's possible that it goes back up to test this trend line, right? It's possible that it goes back up to test that trend line. That's always a possibility. It's also possible that it just goes back up to test that trend line right there, right? Where it basically comes back up and it just goes to that level, right? The 0.382, rather than up here, because you could argue it already had that rally right there. My point, though, right? My point in all of this is to say whether a counter trend rally goes here or here, the ultimate outcome for Sol Bitcoin is that it likely will end up down here in 2026, right? That's sort of the main thing that I think I'm trying to communicate, and I think it's difficult because getting the path exactly right is hard, because no one knows exactly how it's going to shape up or how it's going to play out exactly. Now, the other thing that I think you should consider with Sol Bitcoin is that while it is at the same level, right, it's at the same level at the point that it bounced at, or that ETH Bitcoin bounced at in 2022, it doesn't mean that it's going to hold as support, right? If you see Sol Bitcoin go to like 13,000 sats, then it's deviating from what ETH Bitcoin did. Okay? So if it's at 13,000 sats, it's deviating from ETH Bitcoin, and I would not expect that pattern to continue. There is an idea that Sol Bitcoin could just be speed running what ETH Bitcoin did. With quantitative tightening potentially ending about mid-year, it's certainly possible that it just sort of speed runs it and then gets another rally from a lower level. But I do want to respect some of these levels, because you can see that Sol Bitcoin tends to have sort of pivot points around some of these fib retracement levels that it's been respecting over the last number of years. And now with it at the 0.38 or the 0.236, it is relevant to think about that. So if you go back and watch the prior video, I talked about this a lot, right? I talked about this a lot, and it's the whole idea of when you're at range highs, people don't want to listen. When you go to a low, everyone's willing to listen. But because everyone's willing to listen, it ends up forming some sort of short-term bottom in the market, okay? The other thing to remember is that Sol USD is not the same thing as Sol Bitcoin, right? They are two very different things. Let me show what I mean. ETH Bitcoin has been trending down for years, right? But ETH USD has been trending up. Even though ETH Bitcoin was going down, ETH USD went up. This was also something that was very difficult to communicate with people, right? Because for me, I was just like, well, if you're going to hold something, why don't you just hold Bitcoin instead of holding Ethereum? Because Ethereum is just going to bleed on its Bitcoin pair. So then what happened was a lot of people that would have bought ETH decided not to buy it. But the problem is that they didn't buy Bitcoin. And so while ETH Bitcoin bled, ETH USD went up. If you value if your unit of account is Satoshis, it makes it a lot easier to navigate the market, because you sort of have your Bitcoin stack that you're always comparing to the rest of your portfolio. But if your unit of account is not Satoshis, then it's understandable why seeing a rally on ETH USD, even though ETH Bitcoin was going down, could be difficult, right? It certainly could be difficult. So please remember that Sol Bitcoin and ETH Bitcoin and any other altcoin on their Bitcoin pair tend to be oscillators at best. Also consider that Sol Bitcoin and Sol USD are two very different things, just like ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD are two very different things. If you want Sol Bitcoin to rally from the 0.236, then I think you would want to see it hold this level as support for the next month. If it can hold this level as support for the next month, like if it can make it through March, through the end of March, into early April, if it can hold this level as support for a month, kind of like it did here, then it would start to favor going back up to 20,000 sats. It's not impossible for it to go back up to the 0.5. I do not think it will take out that high. If it takes out that high, then I'm wrong, right? And I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay admitting when I'm wrong, but I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying. Sol Bitcoin, Sol USD, two different things. If Sol Bitcoin were to take out this high, then my view is incorrect, 100% wrong if it takes out that high. Anything here, or even a wick slightly below that, kind of like this wick right there, it's still technically what I would call a distribution phase. It's just that it's a lot harder to convince people at tops than it is at bottoms. And if you get a major rally by Sol Bitcoin, then, yeah, it's not like I'm going to be able to try to convince people then, right? I mean, imagine if you woke up tomorrow and Sol Bitcoin was back at 25,000 sats. Do you think I would have any luck in trying to convince people it's just another lower high? Absolutely not, right? No one would believe it. So let's talk about it now in case it happens. Now, it also sort of raises the question, well, what possible narrative could there be for something like that? I mean, ETH Bitcoin had the nice merge narrative to get that rally later on. And I don't know what exactly it would be, but I could think of two examples that could lead to a future counter trend rally on Sol Bitcoin. Could be quantitative tightening ending, right? Or it could be, I don't know, maybe a spot ETF, right? A lot of people keep focusing on these ETFs as if they're going to like save the altcoin, especially on its Bitcoin pair. But when the spot ETF launched for Ethereum, I mean, this was the rally, right? And that was that. You got a single rally, that lasted for about a week, and then it just continued to bleed. So maybe that's what would cause it. If there's an approval of an ETF for Solana, that could potentially lead it to getting a bounce, right? But other than that, I don't know. I mean, you have quantitative tightening ending probably mid-year, maybe sooner. You have ETH Bitcoin, ETH rallying whenever its spot ETF was launched, but it still was a lower high. So that's at least what I'm looking at. And I just wanted to try to appeal to the emotional side of things rather than just look at from a technical perspective. Technically speaking, Sol Bitcoin, as far as I can tell, is in a distribution phase, right? This chart does not look good to me at all. ETH Bitcoin did not look good to me either here, and it still got another rally to a lower high. So what I would say is that there will likely be a counter trend rally at some point, but it could still be a month away, right? It could still be a month away. But the major pivot levels I would look for Sol Bitcoin would be these levels, right? 20,000 sats and, 25 to 26,000 sats. Those would be those major pivot levels, at which point it could be difficult. I honestly have a hard time. I'm not exactly that optimistic that it would make it back to the 0.5, but if you look at ETH Bitcoin, right? If you look at ETH Bitcoin, once it got rejected up there, it didn't really spend much more time there. With Sol Bitcoin, I mean, it seems like it's already been rejected at the 0.5 a lot, right? It's already been rejected there a lot with only wicks above it and one move all the way up to 6.8. It's been rejected there so many times that I tend to doubt. I just don't think that it's as high of a probability. I don't think it's as high of a probability that it rallies back up to that level. But, 20,000 sats is a little bit more reasonable of a counter trend rally. Now, some people are going to be like, well, you're saying one thing, you're saying it's in a distribution phase, but it seems like you're trying to cover yourself and talk about these. But that's the thing about markets, guys, is that they don't actually move in a straight line. And that's the hard thing about making videos about markets, is that everyone assumes that when you release a video, it's got to all play out immediately or you were wrong, right? So I'm not under the illusion that the market will move in a straight line. And so I'm not going to stop telling you what I believe, but I also want you to realize that there can be counter trend rallies that don't necessarily mean that the market has ultimately changed. You could get a rally by Sol Bitcoin from the 382 back up to from the 236 back up to the 382, only for it to then bleed down from there and then to go down here, right? It could very well do that. And you might even argue that's a more likely outcome, just because of how many times it's been rejected at the 0.5. What would have to happen for it to go back there again? I don't know. I don't know what would have to happen for it to go back there. To go back to the, to where it was 3 weeks ago isn't as big of a deal. So please be aware that this stuff can happen, right? The market can have counter trend rallies so that it punishes the people, right? The market makes fools of as many people as possible, right? So when people don't want to believe up here, they think they're right and it's going to keep going up, they'll believe down here. So they buy it up here, they sell it down here, and then they buy it again back up here. And then that's the way the market just completely destroys the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. So you need to be aware that these patterns are occurring and that the market can do that just to sort of swindle you out of the Satoshis that you hold. It's never an easy path, the sort of the distribution phase of all Bitcoin pairs. If Sol Bitcoin falls below the 0.382 without a significant bounce, then you could argue this, all of that is completely off base and that it's just speed running what ETH Bitcoin did, right? Like, I imagine there are alt Bitcoin pairs that get, that have had sort of these distribution phases that don't necessarily bounce at every single fib level, right? Or every single pivot point that you might assume it would. But the reality is a lot of altcoins, they don't get massive secondary distribution phases, right? A lot of them actually don't. If you look at this last cycle, like look at Polkadot, it never actually got that secondary distribution phase when Solana did, right? Like dot Bitcoin just continued to bleed, right? And a lot of coins sort of follow that. If you look at like AVAX Bitcoin, and you look at this, right? If you look at sort of, well, I guess this isn't even really the same comparison, but you certainly don't always see things play out exactly the same way on every alt Bitcoin pair. If you look at like ADA Bitcoin, I guess you could argue it had another distribution phase right here. So if you were to look at that, did it bounce at the 236? You can see that it bounced a little before the 236, and look where it went back up to, right? It actually went back up to the 0.382, right? So you can see that pretty clearly. And then eventually the 236 became resistance. And then now it's all the way back down here. So with Sol Bitcoin, maybe you'll see that. Maybe it'll just, get a rally back up there at some point and then sort of fade and then do something like that. I know that's not necessarily what you want to hear, but I have to communicate my macro view while also explaining to people how the market can trick you in the short term to really affect you emotionally and get you to make trades that don't make sense. Think about how many people for ETH Bitcoin probably were just buying it like crazy up here, sold it here, only to rebuy up here, and then to just watch it bleed. So not only did they buy it at the wrong time and sell it at the wrong time, they then bought it at the wrong time again. And that's something, again, that you want to avoid. And hopefully this is helpful for understanding sort of the alt Bitcoin pairs and how you should be aware of how the emotions can be a big deal. So summarize with Sol Bitcoin at 15,000 sats. You know, I think that if it can hold 15,000 sats for a month, then it would favor a rally back to 20,000 sats. That's what I would say. If it can't, then it's just going to speed run the ETH Bitcoin demise, you know, and that's just what I would say. You know, I don't think that I have to justify the fact that distribution phases take a long time to play out, but that's exactly what I'm doing in this video, because I want to appeal to the emotional side that people deal with. And also, you know, I don't really want to you know, I don't really want to experience what I experienced back over here again, where people are just so upset that that they sold the sort of sold that bottom. Only, you know, they didn't want to listen when it mattered, and then they listened when they when they shouldn't have, and then they bought back in when they shouldn't have. So please be aware, the market will try to trick you as many times as possible. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.